The smell was the first thing I noticed. It was the sweet smell of rot mixed with a strange metallic scent that seemed familiar, but that I couldn't quite place. It was so strong that I staggered back, pulling the door shut behind me. My stomach heaved, and several minutes passed before I could make myself open the door again. I pulled my shirt up over my mouth and nose, as if a layer of cotton could keep the smell at bay. I held my breath and opened the door. The room was really more of a cavern cut into the earth. The walls were smooth dirt and rock and oozed a thick green slime. A small fireplace had been carved into one of the walls, and a fire burned within it, producing no smoke or heat, only light. It was the source of the light I had seen in the tunnel. Near the fireplace was a long table. I approached it cautiously, fearing this piece of furniture more than anything I had encountered before. The table had 4 straps, one attached at each corner. The surface was scored with the strokes of many knives, and stained with a dark liquid, which, in the dim light, I could only assume was blood. I felt my stomach heave again, but I cupped my hand in front of my face and caught the vomit before it hit the ground. I didn't want to leave any trace of my presence. Grimacing, I shoved my hands into the pockets of my skirt and cleaned them the best I could. I turned away from the table and began to examine the walls. All around the room were pictures, thousands of them, all of young women or girls, each one smiling happily and holding a small compass. In each picture, the compass needle was pointing south instead of north. The one furthest from the light of the fire caught my eye, and I knelt before it, squinting in the dim light. The girl looked like me, only slightly older. She wasn't grinning like the others, but looked solemnly off to one side. I knew immediately that I was looking at a picture of my mother. Memories came flooding back, and I could suddenly remember every detail of her face. The picture had been folded in half before being hung up with the others, and I carefully removed the nail and unfolded it. There was a dark and handsome man beside her. It was not my father. His skin was a tawny brown, and his eyes just a shade darker. His teeth were straight and white, and he smiled widely at my mother. There was something about his smile that didn't seem right. The happiness reflected in his expression was not present in his eyes. They were cold and angry, a stark contrast to his overall demeanor. And there was something in my mother's face as well, hidden just below the surface. It was a kind of sadness mixed with fear. I put the picture and the nail in my pocket and turned to leave, but then I saw the mirror. I don't know if mirror is the right word for the black polished oval that was set into the wall opposite the door, but I could see myself reflected in it. The reflection wasn't accurate. In the mirror, I appeared taller and older, my skin clear and smooth, but my hair had been replaced by a nest of snakes, furiously writhing and biting each other and trying to get at my eyes. My mouth was frozen in a scream, but my eyes were strangely calm. Without knowing why, I raised my hand to touch the smooth stone, but then I froze. Behind my reflection, I could see a place I knew well. It was the clearing where I had watched Blade disappear into the large rock, and then encountered Evelyn for the first time. I could see Blade now. He knelt before me. A dissected squirrel lay at his feet, and as he spoke those same chanting words, the mirror began to ripple. I ran for the door, but it wouldn't open. His hands were through the mirror as I darted to the table and ducked behind it. It was shadowy there, and I hoped that I would go unnoticed in the dim light. At Valencia's behest, I had started dressing in all black, looking the part of the witch I was to become. I had thought it was silly when she insisted that I do so, but now I was beginning to understand the usefulness of dressing like a shadow. Blade stepped through the mirror, immediately followed by Evelyn. I ducked lower. The girl made me uneasy. I felt that Blade might forgive me for trespassing, but she would not. As she stepped through, she froze and looked around. "What is it?" Blade's voice was different, more timid than his usual confident manner. "Someone's been here." Evelyn's voice was no longer that of a little girl. It was rough and deep and made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I had never heard a sound quite like it. The only thing I could compare it to was the sound of nails on a chalkboard, only multiplied by 1,000,000. It was physically painful to listen to, and I clamped my hands over my ears, though it did little to lessen the pain. "Who could have been here? No one knows how to enter the stone." "What about your girlfriend? You brought her to the cave, and she's seen you enter the stone." I said I was sorry about that. I didn't know Casey was following me. "You haven't been very careful." "She didn't come in through the stone." "What about the door? The cave is wide open, and you brought her there numerous times. She must have wondered what was in there. But she hated it. She would never go there on her own. She would sense it was a bad place. Besides, the winds wouldn't let her enter without letting us know she'd been here. Perhaps. Winds are tricky. I never know whose side they're on, but soon there won't be a choice. It doesn't matter. Come, we have a lot of work to do. I watched Blade build up the fire. Evelyn sat on the table, her little legs swinging just inches from my face. She ordered Blade around in her gruff voice, and he continued to shrink. The fire grew too massive to be contained in the tiny fireplace, and the flames were white-hot when Evelyn suddenly jumped down from the table. She had grown, and now towered above her diminished brother. As I watched, they joined hands, their flesh melting together, and they jumped into the fire. There was a flash and a shower of sparks, and then they were gone. I jumped up from behind the table. The fire was small again, burning low as it had when I first entered the room. I ran to the door and yanked hard. It flew open without resistance, sending me sprawling onto the ground. I jumped up and ran into the darkness. The wind began to scream, and in it I could hear words, guttural and menacing, calling to them, telling them I was there. I ran as fast as I could. The wind was at my face, pushing me back toward the door, but I fought it. The screams grew louder as I neared the opening of the cave. The wind slammed into me with brutal force, and I could see the light of the opening, though it was dim. The mossy trailers had woven themselves together in a tight mesh over the cave's opening, and very little light passed through. I grabbed a small knife that I had tied to my waist, another of Valencia's requirements, and I began to slash at the moss. A brief burst of sunlight came through the gash before it mended itself. I slashed at it again and again, cutting away the new growth until I could thrust my head through the opening. The fresh air gave me new strength, and I forced the rest of my body through. The moss wrapped around my foot as I fell out of the cave, but I quickly cut it away and ran for home. Valencia was waiting at the edge of the forest, chanting and muttering with her hands held high above her. As I burst through the trees and fell into her waiting arms, the winds died down. The screaming ceased, and it was replaced with an eerie silence. Valencia supported me as I stumbled toward the house. My body felt drained, as if another step would sap what little energy I had left, but we made it inside. As she closed and locked the door, I leaned heavily against the wall. My head was throbbing, and little spots of light danced before my eyes. Darkness was beginning to close in around me when Valencia took my arm. "What have you done, child?" Her voice called me back, and the darkness faded. A little of my strength returned, and I was able, with her assistance, to make it into the hidden room upstairs. Once I was settled onto the couch, she left to make some tea, assuring me that the house was protected by many charms and spells, and that no one would be able to enter. I lay in the dark room, still breathing heavily. My heart pounded uncontrollably, and when the darkness came this time, I surrendered myself to it and fell into a troubled sleep. Chapter 7. I awoke several hours later. Valencia was watching me, and her face was worried and aged. She helped me sit up and handed me a cup of fragrant tea. I inhaled the scent of mint and lemon and felt revived just from the smell. The tea warmed its way down, and I was soon able to hold my head up and sit without support. We sat in silence, looking at each other without speaking, but I could feel Valencia reading my thoughts. And now I could read hers. I saw my mother, as she had been in the picture, but the dark man beside her was angry, not smiling. With a word, he cast my mother down. My father rushed to her side, but he too was knocked senseless with a word and a flip of the wrist. I saw Valencia, alone in this house, awakened suddenly, screaming and weeping for her fallen daughter. I reached into my pocket and brought out the photo, scratching my finger on the nail in the process. When I held it out to Valencia, vibrant red drops of blood fell onto the picture, obscuring the man's face. She took it with trembling fingers, and I could see tears in her eyes. She sat looking at it for a long time. I kept hoping she would speak and break the dreadful silence, but she didn't. "Who is he?" My voice was low, and for a long time Valencia did not answer. She didn't even move, and I began to wonder if I had spoken aloud or just thought the question. Either way, she should have heard me. I asked again. She sighed and rubbed her eyes, wiping the tears away before she spoke. "I think you know the answer to that already. We've spoken of him before. He was the king of the Raskies." the form his evil half took during your mother's generation. What about the good half? An answer to this popped into my head, but I couldn't believe it was true. I wanted Valencia to tell me I was wrong. Another man, the other you saw in my thoughts just now. You knew it before you asked. The other half was your father. But he killed him as well. It's not possible. Valencia sighed again. The topic was a painful one, and I knew that it hurt her to speak of it. I reached over and took her hand. She smiled weakly at me and squeezed my fingers. He did not kill them that time. I can't think about the time Clara died. It's too painful. They will not kill each other, Casey. Remember that, always. No matter what the good one feels for you, they will always protect their other half, for they are truly one. A sob interrupted her speech, and she sat crying for a long time. I began to wonder what time it was. I had no idea how long I'd been out, and we had spent a great deal of time sitting in silence. Valencia began to calm herself, and was soon once again able to speak. I'm sorry. This is a very painful subject for me. I failed your mother. I tried to make her understand, but she wouldn't listen to me. She was blinded by love for your father, and later with lust for the other. That's how they get you. That's how Sparks got to me. Witches are much like other women, Casey. We are capable of love and can fall because of it, just like anyone else. That's why I tried to warn you against loving that boy. I know how you feel, but I don't want to lose you. You're the last hope for the witches of Norg Hollow. They must know I was there. The wind was so loud. You must pretend that you were not. They already know what you are, and I'm sure they know you have started your training. Your changing clothing is proof enough of that. I'm not sure what their plans are, but something big is coming. It's in the air. The outcome will change everything, and you must be prepared. I'm scared. I know, dear. It's natural to be so, but you must not let it keep you from your duty. Now, if you are strong enough, follow me. Time is running out, and I must transfer as much of my powers to you as I can. There isn't a moment to spare. We've already wasted too much time. Valencia went to the wall of the hidden room and tapped 3 times. A panel slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. From there, she drew a small package wrapped in brown paper. She removed the paper and handed me a brown leather box. I undid the clasp, designed to look like a snake, the emblem of Norg Hollow. Inside was a small golden compass. Its needle pointed south, like the ones I had seen in the pictures. This compass is the last of its kind. It was traditionally given to the witches on the day they completed their training. The needle points south so that a witch may someday find her way back to Norg Hollow. Your training would usually take much longer, but we will have to move things along. I wish it could have been different. The Rasky has never found a witch so quickly, but he had a special connection to you. The compass is a death sentence, or it has been to all the witches born in this world. Upon receiving it, all have met a terrible death at the hands of the Rasky, including your mother. I hope for you it will be different. I picked up the compass. The face began to glow, golden and warm, in my hand. Valencia smiled. It is a good sign. She pulled back a tapestry, revealing another passage, and I followed her down a long corridor. I lost sense of where we were in the house, but when we emerged, I recognized the room immediately. It was a room near the freezer, an eyesore from the outside, jutting off of the house at odd angles and composed of something resembling stucco. I had been through this room a few times before. It was dusty. Cobwebs hung from the high ceiling, and the evening sunlight that streamed through the dirty window sliced through the dust in shimmering beams. There were gray mounds throughout the room, sheets draped over ancient furniture, and hidden beneath the thick layer of dust that had accumulated for decades. Valencia yanked the sheet off the tallest of the lumps, sending up a massive cloud. I coughed and choked as it filled the air, but Valencia continued to uncover the mysterious mounds. As the dust began to settle, she turned on the lights, and I saw what had been hidden for so long. I wasn't really sure what I was looking at. One was a tall metal box lined with purple silk. It looked like a coffin from the future, with thick wires running from it to a large glass bubble. Beside it was a straight-back chair. Valencia motioned me toward the chair. Sit here, Casey. Do not be afraid. She opened a panel on the side of the space coffin and began flipping switches, causing yellow and red lights to flash. That isn't helping. Sorry. She flipped one more switch and closed the panel. What is this thing? This is a machine your father was working on before your mother was killed. He was all that was good in the King Rasky, and he tried to help your mother. He would have sacrificed himself to save her. It was a noble idea, and it would have ended all of our strife had it worked. This machine was made to transfer my knowledge of witchcraft and my power and strength into your mother. Your father wanted her to be prepared to fight his other half, Nyx, he was called then. I feared this machine. The world has changed so much over the last 4 centuries, and science is the most baffling development of all. It is its own kind of magic. I refused to use it and continued teaching Clara in the old ways, the ways of the witches of Norg Hollow. I was too slow, and when Nyx came for her, she was not ready. She fell prey to his cunning mind, and she died. Valencia stopped briefly, glancing at me with fresh tears in her eyes. I will not make the same mistake again. The old ways must be remembered, but it does not translate to this modern world. The new age of witches will have to cross the borders and be proficient in this world as well as Norg Hollow. That is how we will survive, and the witch's bloodline will endure. Come back here after you have found the island. This is your home now. All the paperwork is complete. Valencia, why are you talking so strangely? Put on the bubble, Casey. I'm not sure what will happen, but I want you to know how much I love you and how very proud I am of you. I hugged her, and we cried together. As we separated, she smiled and put her fingers to her lips. She began to chant, and soon I joined in. We stood holding hands and chanting, and I could feel the magic surrounding us. The air was electric. Valencia got into the box, and I sat in the chair with my back to her and placed the bubble over my head. Magic swirled inside the bubble. Purple and blue streaks swept before my eyes. I took a deep breath and was filled with happiness and strength. I could feel my powers growing, and a calmness settled over me. Pictures flashed through my mind, some beautiful and inspiring, and some violent and horrifying. I could hear Valencia's voice the whole time, speaking strange words, incantations in a language long dead, and yet I knew exactly what she was saying. Her magic flowed into me and became a part of me. Then the colors faded away, and the air grew clear and still. I lifted the bubble from my head and turned toward Valencia. I moved slowly, dreading what I already knew was waiting. She lay in the box, lifeless and gray. I had expected to be horrified, but she looked so serene. Her face was calm, her lips turned up in a small smile. Her hands were clasped neatly at her waist, and there was a look of contentment that lifted my spirits. I gently closed her eyes, whispering a witch's blessing for the dead, and closed the coffin. My father had known when he made it what the fate of the elder witch would be, and he was willing to risk more than just his own life for my mother. Perhaps he had not been entirely good. Perhaps a Rasky can never be completely good, or they would become something else. My father had still been a Rasky when my mother died. He hadn't tried to kill Nyx. He hadn't even fought him until after my mother was dead. But he had left this behind, a present for me, something to help me save me from the next reincarnation of himself. Valencia's death made me angry. I stormed around the house, throwing open doors long denied to me, seeing the house as she had seen it, learning about her life through the things she had collected. A small silver hand mirror caught my eye. The surface was dulled with age, and the misty glass was barely able to show a reflection. I picked it up and absently slipped it into the pocket of my dress. I don't know why I took it. It wasn't pretty or clean. I spent the whole night going through the rooms, too energized by the acquisition of my new powers to sleep. When dawn broke over the treetops, I entered the library. I was following a sound, a low moan that had begun after Valencia passed. I chased it all over the house without locating its source, until I finally came to the library and found that the sound was coming from the book Doomavine. It trembled on the shelf, and when I took it down, it uttered a happy sigh. "Hello, Casey." Its voice was familiar. I didn't answer. "You've come at last. I have waited many years for this moment, perhaps too long, but you are here now. That is what matters." "Who are you?" "I was made many years ago, before your mother was killed. It was her attempt to preserve my spirit, For she knew that no matter what happened at her final trial, I was going to change. Either I would die and vanish from this world, or I would go back for a transformation, returning to haunt your steps until you came of age. She wanted to save a piece of me, as I was with her. We truly loved each other, you know. You're my father? Yes, in a way, I am. Anyway, I'm all that's left of him. The transformation is never quite the same. The halves always come out different. And this new split sounds like a dangerous one. Valencia has kept me up to date on your activities regarding the boy down the road and his sister. She was a kind woman, and I am sorry she has passed. I knew it would happen, but the need to speed up your training was too great. Even Valencia could not dispute it. Are you still a Rasky? Somewhat. There is still a connection, hence the story about my existence that Evelyn enjoys so much. Of course, it couldn't be completely accurate, or they might have found me first. I used them to communicate with you, to let you know where I was. It was dangerous, for they have been looking for me for a long time. Their powers are weakened, as long as I remain missing. How do I know I can trust you? The book sighed in my hands. You don't, but I hope you will before we part. We'll see. We may part sooner than you expect. The book jumped in my hand. That must not happen, Casey. No matter what befalls you, you must make sure that I am with you, or you will not survive. The king of the Raskies was very, very powerful, far stronger than the witches ever anticipated. The power of one half of him is almost equal to that of a witch. I mean no offense. I only wish to prepare you for what is to come. I didn't answer immediately. I couldn't help wondering if Blade would protect me if Evelyn attacked. I wanted to believe he would, that he loved me as much as I loved him. I wasn't willing to give up what small hope I had. After some time sitting in silence, the book demanded my attention. He asked again to be kept with me at all times. I agreed, though hesitantly. I couldn't imagine bringing him with me when I was next alone with Blade. The rest of the night was spent listening to the book talk. It was as if he was making up for the last decade spent in silence. He asked me to call him Doomavine, but for some reason I couldn't speak the name aloud. My tongue refused to allow it, so I called him Duma instead. Duma spent the evening instructing me on the history of Gredig, and warning me against different aspects of his power and magic. It was informative, for he told me things that Valencia had never alluded to and perhaps had not known. Her death still seemed surreal, and I had not yet allowed myself to accept it. When she walked into the library, I was stunned. She was now Valencia as she had been seen by the world, frail and crippled, with the eyes and hair of a maniac. I threw down the book, ignoring his cry of protest, and ran to her. I hugged her tight and heard a terrible snapping sound. Valencia muffled a cry of pain as I jumped away from her. Her bony fingers grabbed her skeletal shoulder, and she was biting her lip in pain. There were tears in her eyes, but she smiled at me when she spoke. Careful, child. I am happy to see you as well. When I woke, I doubted either of us had survived that horrid machine. I see you have met Duma. He was not your mother's brightest idea, but he has served his purpose over the years. You nasty old woman. You kept me silent for far too long. Think of the damage we could have done to the Rasky before he even found Casey. We could have saved her from this terrible fate. More likely she would have died much sooner, before her training began. The fact that they found her so quickly, I credit to your existence. I should have burned you when I had the chance. You didn't dare. Even in this form, you could not destroy me. I am too powerful, and your time is done. Why didn't you pass away and leave the girl to fight her battle? It was selfish to save some of yourself. You should have given her everything you had. Valencia froze. Her eyes were fixed with intense hatred on the book lying at her feet. I picked him up and placed him back on the shelf. The shelves shook with the strength of his rage, but his protest died down after a few minutes when he realized the futility of his efforts. I turned to Valencia. She lowered herself slowly into a chair, still holding her shoulder. I went to her and placed my hands upon her shoulder. She winced and tried to pull away, but I held her there, focusing all my energy into her shoulder until it began to glow. A moment later, I stepped away. She rolled her shoulders and sighed. Thank you for taking the pain away, Casey, but I cannot allow you to do such a thing again. You will need all the strength you have to fight them. I will not have you wasting it. Here, drink this." She handed me a small vial of golden liquid. "What is it?" "Demi-Vale, a special sleeping serum. You have very little of this night left, and you must rest. This will help you wake refreshed no matter how little sleep you get tonight." "When will the fight begin, Valencia? You're acting like it will be soon." "I don't know, dear. I'm not sure when it will come or in what form, but I feel that it will be very soon. I want you prepared. The end is coming. Of the Raskies or the witches, I know not, but soon everything is going to change. Sleep now, while you are able." I drank the vial. It was warm and tasted sweet, like honey and rose petals. My eyelids became very heavy, and I lay down on the floor of the library, unable to even make it to the couch. Valencia covered me with a warm blanket. Darkness crept over me, and I knew no more. Chapter 8. Valencia was gone when I woke up. The sun was already above the treetops, and Blade stood on the back lawn, smiling up at me and waving. I moved slowly toward the library door, simultaneously dreading and desiring my encounter with Blade. The bookshelf began to rattle, vibrating other books off the shelves and onto the floor. I crept to Dumavine and timidly pulled him out. "Finally. Bring me with you. I know you're going to see your boyfriend. This could be it, and I might be able to help you. Promise me you won't say anything. You won't give yourself away to Blade." "Blade? What an awful name. I promise I will not say one word unless we are alone. I'm here to help you, Casey. That's the whole reason your mother made me." "Fine, just be quiet." I shoved him into my backpack and threw it over my shoulder. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the desk, a small green bottle with a tag. The tag was labeled Gooey. There was a note underneath the bottle, written in Valencia's fragile handwriting. "Dear Casey, I am not strong and will not be able to join you on your journey. I hope to see you again before it is all done, but if I cannot, know how much I love you. Take Duma with you, so he may be of use and redeem himself. I hope he will not cause you harm. Take this bottle with you as well, but do not use it unless you absolutely must. It will help you when everything looks bleak and you are out of options. Good luck, my child. May you be blessed by the witches who came before you. Valencia." I put the bottle and the note in my pocket and hurried outside to meet Blade. The warm sun glistened on his beautiful hair, and he was smiling the smile that made me fall in love with him in the first place. His hands were in his pockets, and he seemed nervous. The toe of his sneaker burrowed into the thick grass, and his eyes were trained steadily on the ground between us. "Hi, Casey." "Hi." Silence followed, a tense silence filled with waiting. There was a rustle in the trees, and I jumped and turned to see Evelyn step out of the forest, carrying a bright pink box. It was the game's Sweet Adventure, and her eyes glowed with excitement. Her curly pigtails bounced as she ran toward us. "Look what I have. It's my favorite game in the whole world, and we're going to play it." Blade looked at me sheepishly. "Do you mind? She won't stop bugging me about it." "You promised you'd play it with me, Casey, remember?" I was stunned. The change in Evelyn was amazing. Had I not known what she truly was, I would have thought I was just looking at a little girl who was very excited to play her favorite board game. I nodded and tried to smile. "Sure, I'll play." "Hooray!" Her enthusiasm was a little over the top, as if she was playing a part and had overdone her role. "I get to be pink." Blade rolled his eyes. "What else?" Evelyn ran into the backyard and up the hill, stopping in front of the entrance to the maze. Her eyes were big and round as she gazed at the towering hedges. "Ooh, I want to play in there. Can we, Blade? Please?" Her voice hovered in a high-pitched whine, and we both winced. Blade looked at me, his face a mask, playing the role of irritated older brother to perfection. Everything he did was perfection, even deceiving me. I shrugged my shoulders and nodded. Evelyn didn't wait for anything more. She squealed and raced into the maze, followed by Blade calling for her to slow down and stay close to him. As I followed them, I touched the bag on my back to reassure myself that Duma was still there. He stirred briefly, but did not speak. We reached the fountain without incident, and Blade insisted that we bathe ourselves in the waters. I tried to seem agreeable, but when the others dunked their heads, I splashed some water over mine instead. I didn't trust anything Blade did anymore, and the taste of the vile black waters was still fresh in my memory. Blade and Evelyn looked at me oddly when they surfaced, and tried to keep their eyes from drifting to my merely damp hair and dry clothes. Evelyn knelt and began setting up the game. "Have you ever played Sweet Adventure, Casey?" "I did when I was little." Evelyn smiled. There was something in that smile that made my knees weak. There was something underneath the sweetness that looked a lot like pure evil. "Well, we play it a little differently than most people, but I think our way is a lot more fun." I turned to look at Blade, but he had vanished. "Don't worry about my brother. He's just gone to get what we need to start the game. He'll be back. He wouldn't miss this for anything. He's quite in love with you. Did you know that? He kisses a picture of you every night before he goes to bed. Idiot." Just then a terrible scream ripped through the bright morning. A large dark mass flew through the air above us and crashed into the fountain. Blade emerged from the maze, his hair and clothes rumpled, and his eyes on fire. Valencia groaned from atop the lion, her fragile body bent and broken. Blood filled the fountain as she groaned once more and lay still. I started screaming and ran at Blade, intending to tear out his eyes with my fingernails, but he grabbed me and threw me into the fountain, bathing me in my great-grandmother's blood. Blade and Evelyn knelt at the edge and drank, gulping down the dark red water and grinning with gruesome red mouths. I struggled to my feet and lunged at Blade. He retaliated and with a swift, powerful kick sent me flying back into the lion. I heard Duma muffle a scream as we smashed into the stone. Blade stepped into the water and lifted me in his strong arms. "I didn't want to do that, Casey. Please don't make me do it again. You've agreed to play our game, and you will play by the rules. Do you understand?" I nodded. His breath was in my face, hot and stale, like a room that had been shut up for years and baking in the sun, while everything in it wasted away to dust. Evelyn stepped forward. "Rule number 1, she said, her voice shrill and out of control. Drink up." Blade shoved my face into the fountain. I clamped my lips shut, refusing to drink, but he was patient. He held me under until I could no longer hold my breath. My lungs burned, and my mouth flew open. I sputtered and choked, fighting against him, but before he released me, I drank. It tasted like pennies, and it burned my throat. I threw up as soon as Blade released me, but that didn't seem to matter. Evelyn was kneeling beside the board. Blade joined her, and they both looked up at me expectantly. Evelyn held out the stack of star-shaped pink cards. "You go first." The game was very simple, designed for little kids under 6 years old. The player chose a card. Each card had a color or a shape on it, and you moved your game piece to that color or shape. Some of the cards had special characters, jolly elves and prancing fairies, and they usually gave you extra turns or an opportunity to roll the dice of chance. I drew my first card fearfully, unsure of what would happen once I did. It was a yellow sun, and I moved my star-shaped game piece to the matching space. Instantly, I felt the temperature rise. The day had been cool, a sign that summer was ending and school was fast approaching. But now the air became hot and sticky. The breeze died, and the sweat beaded on our foreheads. Blade quickly took his card, a blue diamond. The temperature dropped severely, freezing the sweat onto our skin. Evelyn took her card, an orange hexagon. I wondered what would come of that, until the hedges began to change color. The leaves changed from a rich, dark green to dry, brittle orange. The game continued like that for a while, each card changing our surroundings, but affecting nothing more. On one of his turns, Blade drew a card with a red heart on it. He turned to me, his eyes so full of love that I felt my cheeks grow hot in spite of myself. He passed the card to me, and our fingers touched lightly. And the feeling of his touch lingered long after our hands had parted. Evelyn made an unpleasant gagging noise and pulled the next card. On it was a tiny blue fairy, holding a pair of dice in one hand and a question mark in the other. Suddenly the air was filled with the whirring of thousands of tiny wings. Fairies of every color filled the sky above us, darting in and out and doing tricks. In a shower of sparks, the blue fairy descended, holding the dice and a tiny golden box. She did not speak as she held out her hands to Evelyn. The girl turned her dark eyes to me and smiled. "I think I'll pass on the trinket. It's time to roll the dice and take a chance." Her grin was terrible. Her teeth were small and sharp, and there seemed to be too many of them. She took the dice from the fairy and threw them onto the board. A swirling ball of light appeared before us, and Evelyn was sucked into its blinding radiance. The ball floated through the air and down one of the 8 paths of the maze. The light faded, and the fairies vanished, leaving Blade and I alone in the morning sun. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Blade watching me. He fidgeted nervously. I wondered if their game was not going according to plan. He took a deep breath and let out a long sigh. Finally, he spoke. "Casey, listen to me. Evie will be back soon, and we haven't got a lot of time. The special cards are where the trouble lies, not so much for us as for you. Evie is probably turning them against you right now." "Who?" "The creatures. The ones in the game. They're real, but only in this place. The maze is a portal, a doorway to a place of magic far beyond the powers of Witch and Rasky combined. Only that power can reunite the halves of the great Rasky King, but it needs a very powerful sacrifice. The last witch of the Norg Hollow bloodline. You must play for your life. Do anything necessary, even if it means killing me. You must not hesitate. I will not be able to help you when she returns. This is all the help I can give you, besides my undying love." "I don't understand." He silenced me with a motion of his hand. "She's coming." Evie emerged from the path. Her dress was torn and dirty, and her hair disheveled. She was smiling, but seemed tired to the point of exhaustion. She collapsed on the ground next to me, and I could smell a sharp, acidic scent mixed with the light, powdery scent of a little girl. She looked at me with her eyes darker than before and grinned that terrible grin. "Your turn." Blade was the next person to draw a special card, a pink fairy carrying a large club and a pair of dice. I saw Evelyn watching him closely, as the pink fairy broke from the group swarming above and approached him. Blade kept his eyes steadily on the fairy, ignoring his sister. His voice cracked a little as he took the club and rejected the dice. Evelyn glared at her brother, but did not speak. She pulled a card, a red flame. The hedge burst into flames. Intense heat and smoke surrounded us. Sweat rolled down my back, and I could feel my dress clinging to me. The cards were covered in soot as I pulled the next one. It was an elf. The flames around us went out, green leaves sprouted once again, and the musical laughter of 1,000 voices erupted from the hedge. Little faces peered out all around us. They laughed joyfully or menacingly. It was hard to tell. One came forward with dice in one hand and a small golden box in the other. The same choice Evelyn had been given in the beginning. "Give me the dice." I rolled and the light came. I was lifted off my feet and swiftly carried deep into the maze. When the glowing orb released me, I stood at the foot of a great snow-covered mountain. The hedge walls had vanished, and I was surrounded on all sides by snowy plains. An icy wind howled down the mountainside, screaming past my ears. My fingers were numb from the cold. I flexed them and slapped my hands to get my circulation going. There was a shriek on the wind that made my blood run cold. I looked to the top of the mountain. There was a glimmer there, something silvery high above me. The shriek came again, shaking the ground and letting loose an avalanche. Snow and rocks came thundering toward me. But before I could react, I heard the same shrill scream again. Riding down upon the snow was a woman clothed in white fur. Her eyes were silver and piercing. I held her gaze and stood my ground instead of trying to outrun the avalanche. I held my hands out before me, lowered my head, and closed my eyes. The sound was deafening. Snow and boulders thundered all around me, but I was safe. An energy force surrounded me, a tool I must have gained from Valencia. It went on forever. I could feel my strength weakening, and once I lost focus and a small rock slipped through and smashed into my skull. I saw spots before my eyes and felt blood trickling down my face. I struggled to refocus my energy and keep up my shield. When the snow finally slowed, I lowered my arms and looked around. There was a waist-high wall of snow all around me, and then I heard laughter. The woman approached. She walked lightly over the snow, her steps barely disturbing the flakes on top. She was beautiful, perhaps the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. Her hair was white gold and hung down to her waist, adorned only with a crown of icicles. Her lips were pale pink and curled into a cruel smile. From under her long fur cape, she pulled a large icicle, wielding it like a mighty sword. I started to claw my way out of the hole I was standing in, the snow falling away under my hands and feet. The air grew colder as she approached. It burned my lungs as I struggled to free myself. I scrambled to the surface and spoke a word, becoming as light as air and running fast over the snow. I could hear the woman following close behind. The white plains stretched out in front of me, and far ahead I could see a river, a stripe of darkness slicing through the endless white. I ran for it. The Ice Queen was closing in as we neared the riverbank. Once I felt her icy fingers graze my shoulder, and I called forth speed I didn't know I had. The distance between us grew, and I splashed into the cold, rushing waters. I heard the woman cry out, her voice fell and terrible. There was a sharp crackle that traveled quickly down the river as it began to freeze. I had one foot on the opposite bank when the river froze solid around me. I yanked hard on my leg, but it was stuck. The queen raised her cold, cruel knife. I lowered my head, anticipating the blow, and muttered a few words in a strange tongue I had never heard before. My body grew hot. My skin turned red and radiated heat. Flames shot out of my fingertips, and soon my whole body was engulfed. The river flowed once more, and I was free. I turned on the Ice Queen. Her look of composed cruelty wavered when she beheld my face. With a primal scream, I leapt into the air and threw myself upon her. She thrust her icy blade at me, but it melted as it touched my burning flesh. Her hands touched me and turned to steam. She ran from me in terror, and I stood watching her flee. She turned suddenly and called forth a great gale of wind that knocked me off my feet and plunged me into the cold, churning waters of the river, extinguishing my flames. Massive, dark storm clouds gathered overhead. The thunder rumbled ominously. Rain pelted down and froze into sharp, thin daggers that pierced my skin and burned me with their coldness. I cupped my hands and breathed into them. A ball of fire grew between my fingers. I threw it over me, and it exploded into a canopy of flame and heat. She ran at me and tackled me to the ground, steam erupting all around us as we screamed and clawed at each other. I managed to free my hands for a brief moment and chanted words I didn't understand. My hands burst into flames, and I grabbed her face, watching it vanish beneath my fingers. Her final scream echoed in my mind long after she was nothing more than a puddle. I collapsed, exhausted and spent, and cried until the darkness came over me. When I opened my eyes, the snow was gone. The hedge surrounded me. I slowly got to my feet and emerged into the sunlight. Blade and Evelyn were still seated around the game, waiting expectantly. Their reactions upon seeing me were a study in opposites. Blade's face erupted into one of his handsomest grins, while Evelyn's face fell, and she glared at me darkly. I settled myself back on the ground between them. Blade reached over and squeezed my hand, and Evelyn made a disgusted sound. "Just take your turn, Blade. This is taking forever." She turned to me, once again smiling sweetly. "You took so long we thought you weren't coming back at all." "You wish. Let's play." Evelyn's smile vanished, and she looked like she might jump on me at any moment and claw out my eyes. Blade's small laugh as he took his card made her quiver with rage, but she held her tongue, and the game continued. Chapter 9. The game dragged on forever. There were not very many of the special cards, and everything else was just filler. This game would be settled on one of the chance turns. That much was very clear. But we had to play by the rules and could not hurry things along. I was beginning to enjoy the changes in our environment as the cards were drawn. I drew a card with a purple petal on it, and the hedge exploded in tiny, bright purple flowers. Their scent was warm and gentle and almost overwhelming. It made Evelyn gag, and I laughed out loud. The cards, once pulled from the stack, vanished as soon as they were placed upon the board. But there was one I had not put back, the card Blade gave me, the red heart. I slipped it into my pocket when Evelyn wasn't looking. I could feel its warmth against my skin. Blade had seen me do it, and I saw him glance at me several times with a gentle smile that melted my heart. Evelyn pulled the next special card. It was a green fairy this time, carrying a long sword and the dice. She chose the dice without hesitation, and as soon as she vanished, Blade kissed me. It took me by surprise, and I fell back on the grass. He laughed and helped me up. He placed his hand over the pocket that held the card. It was glowing through the dark fabric of my dress. "I'm glad you have this. Keep it close, and my heart will always be with you." We were sitting close together with our arms barely touching. He took my hand and laced our fingers together. As he traced his finger over the bones of my hand, I felt a stab of fear. He was strong, his hands far larger than mine, and he could crush the tiny bones of my hand with very little effort. His attention to me had always been varied, and, until now, he had not been overly affectionate. I kept looking at the path where the light had carried Evelyn, waiting for her to appear suddenly and catch us together. Blade saw I was distracted and gave my hand a gentle squeeze before moving away. Caution is needed. I keep forgetting. I feel like I haven't truly seen you until today, Casey. You're very beautiful. I didn't know how to reply. I wanted his words to be true, but I couldn't believe them. I couldn't forget the sight of Valencia's broken body and the look in his eyes when he emerged from the hedge. I shook my head. I couldn't think about any of that right now. The game needed my full attention. I suspected Blade might be trying to distract me so Evelyn could catch me off guard. As much as I wanted to, I just couldn't trust him. As if to demonstrate the need for caution, Evelyn appeared suddenly through an opening in the hedge. A long scratch ran down her cheek, slowly oozing tiny drops of blood, but she was smiling. Her footsteps were light, and we had not heard her approach. I jumped when I saw her standing there, disheveled and grinning. I longed to know what kind of encounters she was having in the maze, and what trials they would cause me in the end. I had little time to wonder, as Evelyn reminded me that it was again my turn. I drew another elf card, and they began their timorous song. One elf stepped from the safety of the hedge. He was carrying a tin pail and the dice. I took the dice without a word, dreading what I would find, and knowing that I must vanquish as many foes as possible before Evelyn could recruit them. The light carried me down a new path in the maze, following a long, straight corridor for what seemed like miles, before taking a series of sharp turns. The light vanished suddenly, dumping me in a heap at the beginning of a stone path. There was a mailbox at the end of the path, with the words, "Grandma's Cookie Club," written in bold pink letters. The path climbed over a small round hill and disappeared on the other side. I followed it to the top of the hill and beheld a small cottage. The cottage was brown and inviting. The windows were surrounded by white decorative moldings that were reminiscent of a gingerbread house from one of my favorite childhood tales. The garden in front of the house was filled with plump red tomatoes and large, tempting strawberries. The flower beds that bordered the house were an explosion of color and beauty. Everything was friendly and warm, nothing like the dreary, snow-laden hell I had been dropped into before. This house was more fitting to the game, but it made me wary. Everything was too perfect, too comforting. It seemed to invoke childhood memories that I knew I had not experienced. It was a bewitching place. The door, a round cream puff in the center of the house, opened slowly, and I braced myself for what was to come. Visions of ghastly creatures filled my head, but the woman who stepped out to greet me could have been anyone's grandmother. She was short and plump with rosy cheeks and small round spectacles. She was wearing a loose-fitting floral dress with an apron, on which she dusted the flour from her hands before waving to me. "Come in, dear child, come in. I have just taken the cookies from the oven, and they should be just cool enough to eat." I tried to stall. I didn't want to enter that cottage. Becoming trapped in a small house could not end well. The woman just smiled and beckoned to me with one plump finger. "There's nothing to be afraid of in Grandma's house," she said. "I just want you to be nice and comfortable. We have so much to talk about. I have cookies and tea waiting in the kitchen, and when we're done, I can help relieve you of your worries. Take a small break, my dear. The game will still be there when we are finished." Well, okay. I moved slowly toward the cottage. In my backpack, I could feel Duma fighting, struggling to communicate something to me without breaking his silence. I grew more apprehensive, but I couldn't turn back. I wasn't sure what would happen if I refused the challenge, and I wasn't planning on finding out. I wondered if I might be able to recruit the old woman to my side, though I doubted that she would be of much use in battle. I decided I had to try. The inside of the cottage was smaller than it looked from the outside. The walls were plastered with brightly colored wallpaper, with shells and flowers and cats dotting the eye-popping hues. The kitchen was small and decorated with bright pink floral designs. It was warm and smelled of the gooey chocolate chip cookies cooling on the wire rack on the counter. The table was set for tea, with small white china cups decorated with pink roses, and a matching teapot. "Have a seat, my dear. I'll get you some of my delicious chocolate chip cookies." While she busied herself getting a plate from the highest shelf in the kitchen, I took a look around. The refrigerator was covered, top to bottom, with pictures of cats. And as I sat there, a fluffy gray cat rubbed against my leg and jumped onto the table. It sat there staring at me with huge yellow eyes until the old woman shooed it away with a dish towel. She placed the plate in front of me. There were little flowers around the rim, and the cookies smelled heavenly, hot and fresh from the oven. I inhaled again and felt Duma jump against my back. There was another smell under the sweetness, something metallic and sulfurous. I had smelled the same thing when I first met Evelyn. The old woman smiled and pushed the plate closer to me. Her dentures were crooked, and her skin sagged on her bones. Her expression was strangely hungry as she leaned across the table. "Go on, my dear, have one. I'm so happy to have company for tea. I hardly ever have visitors anymore." I pushed the plate away. "No, thank you. I'm not hungry." The old woman's face darkened, and her sweet smile slipped into a desperate, forced grin. "You must try one. I've been baking all day." Again, I declined. Her face became more desperate, and she begged me to eat a cookie. Her voice grew harsh and dry, and her skin turned gray. Large flakes of it peeled away and fell from her face onto the rosy tablecloth. Her eyes sunk deep into her skull, sending her spectacles clattering to the floor. Even as her body withered away, the look of desperate hunger grew. I stood up quickly, knocking over my chair, and backed away. I did not dare to turn my back on the hideous form before me. The woman followed, now so ancient and decayed that pieces of her were dropping as she moved. Her mouth gaped open, and her dentures clattered to the floor as she attempted to speak. "Come back, my dear. I only want to have a little snack." I backed into the door and reached behind me, feeling blindly for the knob. My eyes remained glued to the horror before me. There was a terrible screeching as I threw the door open and sprinted into the front yard. A massive army of cats, in various stages of decay, had formed on the lawn and stood, hissing and spitting at me. I froze. My body was temporarily rooted in place by disgust. A large cat, once a calico, judging from the hanks of mottled hair, let out a cry. The group responded but did not yet move. The woman hobbled to the doorway. I began to move slowly toward the hill, following the stone path while the cats watched and howled. "Go on, my babies," the old woman rasped. "Go get Mommy some brains, and you will have tasty flesh to nibble on." The cats attacked instantly, moving far quicker than I expected and knocking me down. When I hit the ground, the hand mirror rolled out of my pocket. I grabbed it and started hitting the cats as they tore at me and tried to drag me back to their owner. Each time the mirror made contact, there was a squeal and a puff of dust, and then the cat was no more. Still, there were far more than I could handle, and they sank their teeth into my arms and legs, dragging me back to the house and their hungry mama. The old woman still stood in the doorway, drool visibly dripping down her chin. She licked her cracked lips hungrily. "That's it, my good babies. Bring Mama her dinner." The cats deposited me at her feet, and she leaned over me. Drool dripped onto my face, and I screamed. I threw my hands out in front of me, still holding the old mirror. The woman froze in horror. She grabbed the mirror, unable to look away. "Is that me? That's me? I'm hideous! Hideous!" Her last word was cut short as she burst into a cloud of dust, and her final scream was carried away on the wind. As the dust cleared, the cats looked around in confusion, mewing pitifully and calling for their mother. I stood up. The cats had lost interest in me and were milling about the yard. The sound of their cumulative mewing was loud and abrasive, and I hurried into the house and began searching the cupboards. It took me a while to find what I was looking for. Most of the cupboards were filled with rotten bags of candy and other sweets, moldy cookies, and sour milk. In a small cupboard above the sink, I finally found the cat food. I opened can after can of the smelly stuff, throwing them to the ground as the cats filed into the kitchen. They fought viciously over the first few cans, and several began climbing my legs. When the cupboard was empty, I made my way back outside, covering my face with my sleeve. The smell of rancid fish filled the house, and I hurried as quickly as I could, while stepping gingerly through the mass of furry, rotting bodies. Once outside, I rounded up the last few stragglers, placed them inside, and slammed the door. Standing back near the foot of the hill, I stared at the house uncertainly. I knew what to do. The spell was there, in my mind, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I felt Duma moving around in my backpack and pulled him out. Do it and get out of here. You're taking too much time. Who knows what they're up to out there? I thought you weren't going to talk. Sorry, but this place gives me the creeps. I can read minds, Casey, and that woman's was a very dark place. I also know that you need to finish this and get back to the fountain. They're up to something. Don't give them time to plan. Fine. I raised my hand, pointing my fingers toward the house. The sound from inside was getting louder, the confused mewing turning into howls of rage. I could hear the sound of hundreds of claws scratching at the door and walls, trying to break free. As I lifted my hand, the sound grew in volume and pitch until the earth under my feet was quivering. They knew what was coming. I spoke the words, and fire leapt from my fingertips, igniting the flower bushes in front of the house. The old dry wood caught quickly, and soon the whole building was consumed. The wailing of the animals trapped inside was terrible, but it faded away as I followed the path back over the hill. I entered the maze, and the light carried me back to the fountain. When the light released me, I fell awkwardly and landed in Blade's lap. He smiled as he helped me roll ungracefully off of him, but his smile faded when he saw his sister's expression. Her face had grown very old and angry. There was no trace of the little girl she had once portrayed. She openly wore her rasky face, and it was a horrible sight to behold. Her eyes were black and round and sunk deep into her face. Her chin was long and pointed, with a small mouth that was filled with sharp little teeth. She looked at me with a look of pure hatred, as if any moment she would just leap across the board and tear into my neck with her razor-like teeth. We settled back into our places around the board, and Blade drew the next card, an elf card. Their song was different for him, a lower and more devious chuckle. The elf that stepped forward had dark hair. He was unlike the two I had seen before, who had both had long golden locks. He carried a small pot, painted purple and blue, and covered with complex drawings of serpents and waves. In his other hand were the dice. Blade chose the pot. As he took it from the dark-haired elf, I could smell something sweet, like apples or honey, rising from it. Beside me, Evelyn was barely able to contain her rage. Her entire body was convulsing. Her arms and legs twitched while her face jumped, and her eyes popped. Blade didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the game until she drew her card. He was pointedly avoiding her stare, and it was obvious that he was not following their original plan. Evelyn drew a honey pot, and the hedge turned into giant honeycombs, dripping with thick, golden honey. She ran to the nearest wall and began licking it. Her face and hair were soon completely covered in honey, but she continued to devour it. It was a revolting spectacle. I drew my card quickly, hoping to change it to something disgusting before she realized her turn was over, but I drew another elf card instead. Once more their song began. The first one, high and melodious giggling. A golden-haired elf came forward, holding the dice and a plate of cookies. They looked like the cookies from the old woman's cottage, and I gagged at the memory. I chose the dice.